So, Marie, thank you for being willing to be a guest. We spent a lot of time together. I think we're on a call right after this for People Leader Accelerator stuff. I'll share a little bit of an intro about how I know you through People Tech Partners. We have both been, kind of OGs, and, Jess has been part of that as well. For, I don't know, it's been around close to 10 years, and we've been a part of it close to 10 years as well, which is awesome. And Marie, you were part of our very first People Leader Accelerator cohort 5 years ago, and were the class star. No offense intended to anyone else. You just really stood out. And we had a one-on-one mentoring engagement going on, I think before that, and then continuing after it. And I just got to know you really well. And as we thought about who would be great to be part of faculty, core faculty for PLA, it was a no-brainer to invite you to be part of it. And thank you for being willing to consider that. And right now, I think you're my closest partner with PLA, without a doubt. And I'm so appreciative for that, and so appreciative for you, sharing your home and your family and your professional endeavors with me. And, it's just such a pleasure to talk with you in this way as well, and in a way that some other people can maybe get a window into the world that is Marie. For the listeners that may not know you, would you mind sharing a little bit more about yourself? And maybe Jess and I can pepper in some things. If you don't cover them all, we'll include a couple of nuggets.
All right. I'm going to say I like it. Thanks for having me. I mean, as you say, again, you and I spend a lot of time together collaborating and working on various different projects. And incredibly excited to have Jess as your interlocutor here, because I have for so long respected Jess very much and just watched the way that she, navigates her own career and how she helps others, both people in people seats and other leaders. So Jess, always a pleasure to hang out with you.
Likewise, Marie. And I remember even back when you were at Figma, we had a few times talking about the trickiness and the edge cases that were happening at that time. And so over the years, it's been fantastic just to be able to, I think, watch both of us grow in our careers as well.
And I think you're being nice about those calls, because I think those calls started with Jess, help. But, little shared moments of, wow, here we are on precipice. But let me share a little bit about my background. I always talk about my career as being very much a jungle gym instead of a ladder. I was not, I think, aware of any kind of linear path while I was working through different career steps. I started my career really in journalism, in food magazines, and then, from a kind of twisty path that involved a graduate degree in medieval history, I ended up in ed tech. I'm from the Bay Area originally, although I had gone to college on the East Coast and spent a bunch of time there after graduating. But here in ed tech, really trying to marry those kind of editorial impulses with how does that actually get expressed in a world of technology, and kind of sidestepped into a people role. The company I was at, went through a bunch of business changes, and I realized that actually what I loved doing was making teams more effective, thinking about being a leader for the company as a whole. And so it was really very lucky that I had a CEO who essentially took a chance on me, not having formal HR training, but the kind of opportunity to build out a people function at a company and, really undergo that steep learning curve of the nuts and bolts of HR. I'd been an executive, and so understanding the business that we were in, not just sort of zeroing down. So that was a very sort of someone took a chance on me in that, and I was able to kind of make my swing into the people world. And from there, have just realized retrospectively that I've been doing people work for the entire time, no matter what my job was. And we can talk more about sort of the different ways that got expressed. But today I work now as an executive coach and consultant for myself with leaders in companies who are really kind of on the cusp of transitions and shifts, as I'm sure you can relate with your clients as well. And I co-direct PLA with Andrew and our colleagues, Carmela and Brad.
You are so humble, and there are some fun nuggets that I'm going to drop for the audience as well. Weren't you the editor of a spicy foods magazine?
Confirm. I was, in fact, the editor-in-chief of a magazine called Chili Pepper, The Zesty Life.
Oh, no. Was that part of the title, The Zesty Life?
Absolutely. That was the sort of thinking about spicy food you really have the upscale and the downscale, right? You've got the like sort of the Super Bowl, like chili, and like the 7-layer dip. And then you've got the chefs using, Serrano foam on the fancy things. So you can really, it's a whole culinary and cultural journey, spicy food.
Another data point, you are maybe the most accomplished polymath that I have come across. That's my $5 word. You used something interlocutor. I know what it means, but I probably mispronounced it now. I'd love to make fun of you for your $5 words during PLA. Evidence of your polymathness is that you are also a concert performing musician in a unusual instrument, and met your husband at band camp. Is that right?
Confirm, concur. Yes, lots of confirming. I have been a lifelong musician. And again, if we talk about sort of my path not being linear, but having had elements all along, I think being a musician is an incredible training ground for leadership, for communication, for all sorts of stuff that, I use daily and I coach daily with other people. And so, having been a musician since I was a kid, I come from a family of musicians, but ultimately, yes, I do play an instrument called the viola da gamba, which is an early string. Again, very, very chamber music oriented. And I did, in fact, meet my husband at gamba camp.
Love it. There can't be that many people that have had those experiences. Right.
I think that's true.
No, but you're absolutely right on how many lessons come out of music. Marie and I have sort of like a moment of like, oh, I play violin and you play viola da gamba, and kind of talking about that at some point in our decade-long friendship. There's a book by Ben Zander, who was a conductor of a famous symphony, and it's called The Art of Possibility. So if anybody wants to read more about how being a musician and being a leader overlap quite a bit, his book is excellent. And he wrote it.
Do you still play, Jess? Violin?
I do. I am attempting to teach my daughter how to play the violin, but I learned on something called the Suzuki method, which is very much listening oriented, but requires practicing every single day, which most 8-year-olds are not super excited to do. So, yeah, but I still play, and I actually was in symphony all throughout my university years, and then ended up joining community theater afterwards, which was really fun because you can be in the orchestra pit, listen to a show at the same time as getting to play some awesome music.
Oh, wow. I'm not nearly as musical. I played like trumpet, cornet, baritone in the middle school band, and dropped out when I was trying to be cool. Didn't realize actually the way to be cool is to continue with it like the two of you did. But impressive that the two of you have done so much in business, in professional disciplines, and in music. The whole purpose of this People Leader Accelerator podcast is to support other HR people and other managers inside organizations. And those organizations are trying to grow, and our listeners are trying to grow their careers. And so we'd love to be able to share some tidbits, some nuggets with them that might be helpful in growing their careers, and hopefully take something from us and from our guests to accelerate their career. I'll hand it over to Jess. Would love to learn a little bit more from you, Marie, about some of the things that you're working on now, and maybe a couple of your key experiences along the way.
I'd love to understand better, like the time that you were at Figma. And this past year, Figma was one of the hottest IPOs. You were there in the early days, and you mentioned earlier that you were in ed tech. That's what got you into the people space. Help us understand, like, how did you get from ed tech over to Figma? And given that you hadn't come from the people space, like, what did you feel really adept at being able to do when you started? And what was really, really hard for you as you were kind of getting into a new space in this role?
Yeah. So I think that being in the space I was with the ed tech company where we were building the idea of kind of, reinventing the textbook. So here's a learning object, a textbook that has, in some ways not changed a lot. And so how do you actually make it not only more engaging, but also sort of let everyone find an entry point into it? That kind of philosophy of thinking, not only how is the learner getting access to information in a different way. If I don't understand cell biology when you explain it this way, could I look at it from a different angle and get, an understanding? This was actually what we were doing with our customers as well. So we have your customers as a student, and then you have customers as the publishers. And so this is relevant because there's so much that gets left on the cutting room floor, if you will, when you are somebody who is working in the print space or the knowledge space, but you don't necessarily have technical skill. So the question of figuring out how do we get these brilliant editors who are writing these textbooks, these subject matter experts, but they don't know HTML, how do we get them involved with the creation of the digital enhanced version of a textbook? That to me is a really interesting question, because the structural idea that you don't know HTML, cutting off all of the knowledge that you do have about what might be more interesting, feels to me like a humongous barrier, and something that, again, it's not going to get you the best product. So I'd spent a bunch of time in ed tech working in that space as the content side of things. When I moved into the people space, I didn't lose that hat of caring very much about how did these constituencies interact with each other to create the best possible outcome. Now, when that company was acquired by private equity, that was a whole interesting journey as well to kind of, get a company through M&A, particularly when, again, that was not a blueprint that I had before. But when Figma actually came calling, I got a cold LinkedIn reach out from a contract recruiter who was at Figma. What I saw was the similar capacity of what they were doing to make different constituencies actually have access to the product at hand. What Figma was doing then is democratizing design, not just locked up with the designers who had, proprietary software on their laptops, but bringing it to the cloud and figuring out how to have conversations amongst constituencies that were, again, sort of in the past, perhaps even disenfranchised. Okay, so that was the mental model of like, I've been doing this already. I've been the kind of chief evangelist for these ideas, and the staff and the skill sets that are required to make that possible. So it felt actually like a very, very natural bridge in my mind to go to the space of what Figma was doing. I saw many, many through lines.
That's amazing though, that it was a LinkedIn cold reach out, because like how often is that happening that it turns into like,
Oh, and I wrote back and I said, yes, I'm interested. Didn't hear back and had to follow up a week later. No, I actually am interested. Let's talk.
yeah, see, there's the tenacity that oftentimes when people are like, they ghosted me, they didn't write back to me. It's like, just write again. Thank goodness you did. But what was Figma like? What stage, size? What was it like when you were joining?
So I joined and I was number 48 or so. Figma had actually been around for about 6 years. It was not a brand new company, but it had been around and it had been very small, and it had been very iterative, working on an idea that when it started was really anathema to the design community. And so the kind of question of, even though the company was not brand new, I joined at the point where there were really sort of some things that were starting to work. They had done such incredible iteration over time, really listening to the community. That's always been a hallmark of what Figma has done, is like really not just sort of designed in a vacuum and then been like, blah, here you go, like very, very iterative. So when I came on, it was because it was actually really starting to work. They had been winning over some skeptics. The product was actually starting to work. And it was like, okay, well, now we're poised at the moment where we actually think we're going to start to grow, and grow we did. That first year, this was in 2018, we were sort of adding people. We moved offices. When I started, we were in the old office and I had to share a desk with the data scientist because there weren't actually enough desks. And I feel Figma was a very intensely creative and makery culture. Not surprising, but creativity, again, coming in many, many different forms. Sort of extraordinary people who with all had senses of humor, right? This was not kind of a place where it was just sort of like a bunch of geniuses who, were kind of, hammering away on their keyboard and like, nobody ever laughs. Quite the contrary. I think a lot of delight bubbling around, both because the kind of the problem we were working on was really quite hard technically. It was hard socially. Again, I mentioned the idea of designers being against, concept of people being in their business. And we did a lot of intentional design in our physical spaces, in our programs, in, the way we talk to people, in our internal comms, in our meetings. We intentionally designed things to have an artistic sensibility and art that made you talk about it, not just sort of The idea that like, let's walk by and like all sort of like grab our chin and nod, like, we know what it means. No, like something to really interact with, because that was where we would find, again, these connections and cross pollinations that all ended up in the product and all made it better.
Yeah, I love that you like as I'm hearing you talk about this creativity and innovation, just your background of having sort of that magazine editorial, the music side, like all of these, plus the ed tech experience, kind of I can see how that played together. How quickly did Figma grow? And like, how did you figure out what to focus on first?
How did I figure out what to focus on first? Well, there's the, what is directly on fire in front of you methodology that does inform some of the things that you need to do. I would say that, I mean, again, this was a tremendous learning experience for me. I will not make any claims to have come in sort of knowing what to do and then following some kind of plan. Absolutely not. I mean, 10xing employee headcount. So how fast we grew between 2018 and the end of 2021, when I left, we were 10x. We were more than 500 by December of 21. And again, quite global. And remember, too, the years that we're talking about, these spanned the pandemic. And so the idea again of opening an office in London in 2020, getting a footprint in Europe while we couldn't do the traditional thing of, broadcast all hands live from the new office and, all of the different components. So even if I had had a playbook, I would have had to throw it away. And so I think the kind of, how did I decide what to focus on was really just keeping a beat to what is it that we needed. And the tricky part about hypergrowth as well, right, is that as you are building something, it is breaking. It's like crumbling at the edges because you're already outgrowing it. So it's almost this kind of race, and you have to run a race with a kind of marathon component to it, because otherwise, your surge capacity is going to be completely gone. So it's like you're running, things are crumbling, but if you panic, like you're really going to run right off a cliff. And so it's like, keeping my equilibrium in as much as possible, through the connections of like, well, what is the way in which this is going to advance our culture, get us, obviously in the right compliance space, but just asking these kind of, high level questions, even as the weeds were calling. If you don't kind of come up for the top line view, I think you can tunnel like straight to your demise, down into the weeds. So talking to people, making calls, talking to people like Andrew, talking to people like you, like those were sort of waypoints. But there's also a lot of experimentation that's going on because your unique set of leaders, cultures, problems, opportunities, like really knit together to sort of point in some direction, sometimes conflicting directions about what you should focus on.
Andrew, you look like you have a thought.
Yeah, I have that, like, I want to ask a question face, don't I? I really want to get a little spicy. I'm hoping that you'll share something with us and with the audience, Marie, about, I think of Figma as being one of the great success stories of our generation, really, with the recent IPO and the big pop, even though the stock price is lower now than it has been. A fantastic exit, like 20 billion plus valuation. So many good things, like this creative engine of collaborative software with a lot of people in our space, HR people in tech, they're dealing with the complexities and eccentricities of working with brilliant young founders. And I'm wondering if you might be willing to share some sort of insight into what that was like and how it worked in working with somebody that I don't think Dylan Field ever had a real full-time job outside of the company that he founded. And what's it like being the HR leader for a founder CEO like that when you're on that kind of rocket ship?
I think the question of working with brilliant, again, sort of younger founders that don't have long storied careers behind them is one where you sort of eyes wide open. You come in, you know that there are going to be moments where just the fact that there isn't pattern matching that's happening is going to be challenging and is going to mean you have a lot of education to do. And I would argue that there's also moments where not having that cruft from like, this is how we do it can be a tremendous opportunity for you to co-create with that leader the way we're going to do it here. And we ask these founders, we don't ask, we demand of these founders that they level up and evolve their capacity at this incredibly rapid pace. Every 3 months, that's probably being even generous, right? They almost have to be kind of at the next level of leadership. And, that can be supported in a number of different ways, external. I mean, again, huge fan of coaching, right? But if you think about the position that they are in with their investors, right, telling them certain things with the pressures of the market, and particularly if they have an idea that's a bit contrary, where, again, you could argue that probably a lot of the times the ideas that are contrary are the ones that are going to have the outsize exit if they work, but it requires this tremendous tenacity. And I think there's an element of like finding a founder who has that tenacity, but isn't actually an asshole. I don't know if we can swear on this podcast.
Please do.
That's the golden combo you want. And this doesn't mean you aren't going to argue. This does not mean you're not going to butt heads and you're going to want to tear your hair out. But at the person's core, there's a sense of humanism and like orientation towards understanding like how we are going to actually fire up people to make this happen. At least for me, that was my experience of working with Dylan, is that at his core, I understood him and experienced him to be somebody who really still, even as he was sort of suggesting some impossible things sometimes, like at his core, understood that we were going to get there through influence and people, and the people that we had in our team today, the people we were going to have on our team in the future, and our users and customers. And so, again, I think that there's a sort of eyes wide open understanding that there are going to be the kind of proverbial bees in the bonnet. Your CEO is going to have something that they care about a lot, sometimes irrationally. And you can go and like be really mad about that and expend all that emotional energy. Or you can figure out that that's a bee in the bonnet and kind of figure out how to metabolize that kind of thing so that it doesn't push you over the edge. You have too much to do, too much to accomplish, too much to be influential about to get derailed by stuff that, again, even if it's irrational. So I think that this is what you're signing up for when you're working with founders like that. And so knowing it, understanding what your triggers are, how are you going to handle that? And again, sort of, making sure that you're at least values aligned around the idea that like people are going to be the core of your success story.
What's your take, Marie? Boy, I've had conversations with a lot of, HR leaders over the past couple of years that have been through these rides with brilliant early career, early in life founders who've said, nope, not going to ride that ride again. It was like a roller coaster. It was thrilling and wild, and I'm set. Next job, I want to be with an air quote professional, mature, non-founder CEO. Do you have a perspective or any advice for the other HR leaders out there that may be thinking about like, what's the right fit for me, or do I sign up for another wild ride? What perspective could you share on that front? Archetypes of CEOs, I guess.
It's not necessarily greener grass. It's just different grass, right? This idea of sort of like, grass is greener on the other side. A professional CEO is going to solve all the problems. I would be skeptical of that attitude in general in life, that you are picking a particular bundle of dysfunction to work with no matter where you go. And you have to decide, again, and I use dysfunction sort of in a playful way, right? Where you got to decide, like, what are the ones that are really non-negotiable for you? What really can you just not handle working with? And then optimize for that. And you probably see some threads and patterns for you that like, all right, generally speaking, right? People who have never had a job before and they're starting something, like, I see a fair amount of ego there, or I see a fair amount of fear and insecurity that gets, expressed as command and control. That makes me crazy. I'm not going to do that. But, again, sort of just swinging all the other way to say, well, I'm just going to go to a big company and like, kind of like hide out, and maybe, but like probably within 2 weeks, you're going to be itching at the bureaucracy and the like amount of time that it takes to do stuff. And so again, being just conscious of what's happening here. I would say this is also relevant for people who think about they want to go work for themselves. Because once you go out and you start working for yourself, you realize that it's actually not been your boss's fault all along. It's not been your job fault all along. The call is coming from inside the house. It is you. It is your work patterns. That's the most relevant thing. And I'm not saying there's not externalities and you had to work late. Yes, to all of that. But the most important part of it is actually how you have approached your work and your relationship with accountability, your anxieties about money, all of that, it's coming from you. So again, plug for coaching, because that's the place where you can actually unpack that kind of stuff. And no matter what job you're in, no matter who you work for, you working on that, we'll talk about accelerating. That's going to get you way farther than just sort of like switching jobs because you think this externality is not working.
Talk about a huge gem of wisdom right there of how much is we often are in these roles and thinking, oh, all of these forces that I can't control are causing this. And when you go out on your own, realizing like, oh, what part have I been playing in this all along? And now it's totally in my control because it's my own business. And what do I do about that? I'd love to dive further into that transition. And thank you for sharing so much about like how to think about who to work with, what's the right partner for a CEO. After you went through your incredible Figma experience, walk us through what came next and how did you decide or trade off what those options for were and how you decided what you eventually went to.
I have, despite being around entrepreneurial people for my entire career, back in the food magazines, again, same deal. Like entrepreneurial people have been certainly a hallmark across my experiences. So despite that, I never had for myself the idea of, oh, I want to do that. And there's probably some unpacking about, imposter syndrome and fear, but largely it was around the idea that I am a team person. I love building teams. I love working with teams. I love creating something together. The idea of being out and sort of hanging my shingle on my own was not just not appealing, I would say actively not something that I wanted to do. And so when I did my executive coaching certification, I did it absolutely not with the idea that this would become my profession. But I was like, oh, whatever I do, this is going to be useful because it's a tool for me to understand myself better. Again, we joke, I have all of the DNA components to be the person who gives you the answer. I am the oldest of three. I am bossy. I have been in roles often where I just was vaulted to I'm the head of this. And so therefore I better look like I know what I'm doing. And so that advicey kind of get shit done part of myself, I like that part. I don't want to rid myself of it, but I wanted to expand my range. I wanted to also have other parts of myself that really, really could sit in the kind of coaching space of, I don't actually have the answer for you. What I can create instead is the place for a dialogue for the answer to emerge. I wanted, again, to expand my range. So that idea of doing, in a certification to get there that was my mindset. After Figma, I started doing some experimentation. This was also a very frothy time for people leaders. So you leave a job and you're like, no problem. The job's raining from the sky. So when I am ready to go back in-house, no problem. But I'm going to, try a few things, try some things with VC, try some other projects. And it was really taking that experimental mindset that led me piece by piece to the path of where I've gotten today, as opposed to I have a big target destination and I know I'm going for that. So this is thematic for me, right? I've not had the target destination and linear path, boop, 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 boop. I have used the ways in which experimentation kind of works with my brain to get there. So I tried stuff. I said, well, I have to do some more clients. Like I'll do that. Oh, that's project sounds interesting. But I resisted the urge to go make a logo and a website for myself and make an LLC right out of the gate. That took me a while because I was really kicking the tires on figuring out, can I make what I have, essentially come to think of as a portfolio of activities that are able to feed the various different buckets that I think make me just a better professional. And those buckets, again, are the team bucket, the, intellectually sort of stimulating creative bucket, the, sort of broader helping bucket, the working with groups, this kind of thing. And so I've created a number of different ways to express work, all within the kind of orbit of leadership and management and, again, effectiveness. But that's been my journey. And again, it was through experimentation as opposed to I have one idea and just go execute.
How did you set up those experiments for anybody who's like, that sounds great? I would love to do some experiments. How did you frame that for yourself? Were there any timelines attached to this for how long you would run the experiments, or was it really just whatever comes my way?
That's a great question. And yes, there were absolutely like time parameters that I put on it because I found for me that helped me relax into the experiments, sort of just dialed down the chatter inside of like, well, when are you going to decide? When are you going to decide? And so for me, creating parameters gives a sense of spaciousness. So, for example, this idea of, you know what, I'm actually going to kind of take a break from doing real projects and I'm going to read and I'm going to sort of, fill my bucket. So I did this over a summer and I said, and then by September 15th, I am going to decide what is like the next chunk of experiments that I'm doing. And so then I was able to actually like have an August where I wasn't like, should I be doing stuff? Right. Because I'd already decided it. And I had figured out again, I think on the just sort of life hygiene factor that financially that could work. So I think that's a really big important thing is like, don't let that stuff be a mystery. Actually kind of know, can you have 3 months where, if there's not income coming in the same steady way, because you've always had a W-2 that exists. I joke that, but it took me like 6 weeks after stopping working in-house to stop AeroPressing my coffee like I was late for a meeting. Like, come on, go faster. I mean, it's like on a cellular level, I needed to kind of recalibrate, which was a very interesting education, again, about both sort of like what I had been taking as normal and what was something that I, again, wanted to layer back in. How did I want to be? So setting date parameters and kind of the idea that at that point in time, you can reevaluate and figuring out what are the criteria that you're looking at for that evaluation. Am I having fun? Am I feeling, again, optimistic? Whatever those things are for you, to actually be able to consciously think about what is happening with each of them at those, particularly those milestone moments. That structure was important for me to feel like I could fully be in the experiments.
I love that. And I love that part too of thinking about like, I'm not going to think about the decision until September 15th, as opposed to I have a September 15th deadline and all the way up until then, I'm going to be thinking about it. And just noticing that it takes time to settle into each of these experiments. I've found when people leave a job, they're often like, oh, I'll give myself a couple of weeks. And usually I encourage exactly almost the timeline you were on is like 6 to 12 weeks is what I found for a lot of people need to sort of decompress and get out of one mindset and into another. So it's fantastic you were able to prove that out of what works for you.
All the research shows that. This idea, again, of rest as a co-equal partner to work. It's about how do you actually define this idea of rest and creativity? Because without having had that time, you will make the same decisions that you made before. There's no room for like anything new coming in because you've not been able to, bring in any new inputs.
Yeah. I'm curious, have you worked with any leaders who are in 996 culture or leaning towards that, like more productivity? We've got to work harder. Organizations aren't doing enough. And how do you weave in or navigate that conversation with them?
Well, I certainly don't start with the you need more work-life balance line. That's not effective. Okay. Don't start there. But it comes in, I think, the broader conversations about coaching, about sort of, again, what are the threads that they're following in their own experience of work? I mean, I worked incredibly hard at Figma. I had small kids at that time. So, I would log off to do the kind of pick up dinner thing. And then I would get back online often until very, very late. And so, again, it's hypocritical of me to just be like, well, always put on your own oxygen mask first. I was absolutely terrible at doing that. And what I have found since is that I really actually don't believe it's incompatible to work incredibly hard and also find the ways to fill my own gas tank, which to me, again, is that like the idea of sustainability and like rest. So that's the conversation I'm having with those leaders is genuinely like, where is their gas tank and how are they in fact filling it when they go into a decision tree about, whether they should just keep working or they should, actually do some other interesting activity that will take them offline for a couple of days, and how to navigate that. And it's not, again, for me to advocate, you should rest. That is not a helpful stance, I think. It's much more about this. How do you actually dialogue and figure out this concept of gas tank and pushing? And again, what does that look like? So it's, fundamentally not coercive, which is a way to influence people, but I'd argue not the most sustainable way.
I want to jump in with a little bit of a hot take on this. So experimenting and trying VC and moving into coaching and consulting seems like it really worked for you, Marie. I find myself actively discouraging others from moving into coaching and consulting, largely because I see that not too many people can sustainably pay the bills. Unless your best friend is referring you a ton of business, or unless you have like some reliable, consistent way of generating work, it's interesting, it's intellectually stimulating, you get more control over your own work and who you work with. But often, people that need to pay the bills, struggle with that. Am I doing people a service or a disservice? Like, do you have a take on whether coaching and consulting is for more HR people, or you should have a thick filter?
Andrew, I 100% agree with you. I do not think that this is the path certainly not for everyone. And for lots of reasons. One being this idea that like, if you want to do this, guess what? You started your business 10 years ago. If you do not think about it that way, there's no chance you actually really flourish from like standing start.
Say more about that. What do you mean?
Meaning like the connections you were making, the work that you were doing for the past 10 years is the underpinning of like what it is you would now be doing as a solopreneur. Because clients don't just fall from trees. Like there's this idea again of like, well, what has your experience been? It does not hurt to have a name brand company that was successful. And those are the things that, again, just like with recruiting and TA, we sort of don't like, but that is just part of the truth is that, again, the question of can you actually legate things that you did to some successful, visible outcomes? And say it with a straight face, right? Like it was, stuff that I did had an active impact in the following ways. But more than anything, also, it's the people that you have worked with, that you have been connecting with, because coaching and consulting as a business is all about the networks that you have available to you. I mean, I will say the same thing too, even, when people are thinking about looking for jobs, right? Is that people forget that the idea of networking is one that is a constant through line, not just when you need a job. And in fact, if you're doing it that way, it's likely to be the kind of negative example we have about networking where it feels smarmy. It feels like people are always asking me for things. What if you were doing that and that is just part of your job for the rest of your life? And you can think about it however you need to, hey, I'm being generous. Hey, I'm, figuring out how to connect other people. That, again, networking doesn't always have to be a take.
Absolutely. It's so helpful just to hear how you're thinking about that. And I think it is a tough time to be starting a business for a myriad of reasons, including that there have been a number of folks who've gone and started. And I think thinking about the financial aspect that you mentioned of like, you have to see the whole picture and holistically and how comfortable are you? I think for anybody who's their own business owner, I myself have had a lot of conversations internally around like, what is my relationship with money and why am I so nervous right now? I think that comes up a lot. So thank you for highlighting that piece of it because I think that's a reality. And Andrew, you are doing a service to people to think hard about it as they're getting into it. So they go in eyes wide open. If that's what they want, I think we're not saying don't do it. The world's always in use of people who are really amazing at the work, but really to go in eyes wide open of what the trade-offs are and what are some of the challenges that come up, frankly, as part of it.
And how long it will take. Potentially, right? So just gonna be realistic about the like on ramp and sort of just like try it for 3 months and be like, oh, it didn't work. I quit. Like that also, that's a failed setup of experimental conditions, I think.
Yes. I think that reality too of just how long it takes sometimes for the seed planting to cultivate. I've had clients come back to me like 5 years later after a conversation about working together. And so I'm only being able to see that now having had the business for long enough. So I love that mindset you're bringing up of imagine that you've been in this business for already 10 years. Marie, we've been learning so much from you. We have a final few questions that we do as part of our conversations that we call the accelerator round, very apropos. And so I would love to start with our first question, which is Where do you learn from? I feel like every time I talk to you, there's a different book or a different resource that you're excited about. Where do you learn from right now? And is there one particular resource you're excited about these days?
I learn from reading paper books, which I know sounds anachronistic. And it's twofold. It's not only the information I'm taking in, but is the act of reading a paper book that is actually a neural training, like mindfulness practice, I would say, because you're not hopping around, you're not getting bounced around to other notifications that they, again, coming into that and that tactile thing. I find that that is a place where I really learn. And anyone who's seen my, Zoom background knows that I live in a non-earthquake safe office that is full of books and am always acquiring more. Generally, I find the internet kind of overwhelming and Substack, but I have ones that I subscribe to. But in general, I feel like I've got to actually be fairly choosy about how much I'm trying to incorporate at any given time. The Next Big Idea Club is another place where I learn, and Adam Grant started this. They do a good job of summarizing interesting business ideas. There's an app, there's a, kind of club where you can get paper books mailed to you. That is a place where their summaries I'm finding are actually pretty thoughtful and interesting.
Awesome. Okay. So the Next Big Idea Club from Adam Grant. Next question. What is one sentence of advice that you would share with up and coming HR professionals about how to accelerate a successful career in today's environment?
I have two. Cheating. The mantras of living by: one, be a colander, not a sponge. We talk about this all the time in PLA because the question of soaking it all up means you will not have anything left and you will not be able to even have space to synthesize. So how do you catch the important stuff and let other things pass through you? The second one is, how are you constantly trying to make the implicit explicit? How do you actually take what is assumed, or everybody knows that already, and instead bring it to consciousness? Because this kind of stance of like being in conscious choice about what priorities we're going to actually focus on, or how am I going to deal with the CEO with the bee in the bonnet? Like, don't just let it be sublimated. Bring it to the fore. If you're doing something great, figure out how to make it explicit so others can learn from the greatness, not just like, oh, well, Jess is great and I don't know how to be Jess. So those are my two. Colander, not a sponge. Make the implicit explicit.
That was just so much wisdom right there. Anybody who's like wanting to be a people leader one day or sitting in seat, like rewind and re-listen to Marie say that one more time, because both of those hugely, hugely powerful to being able to be a successful people leader. Okay, we've learned so much from you, Marie. Even though we get to talk to you all the time, I feel like I learned so many nuggets. Last bit, if listeners want to connect with you, what is the best way to be able to do that?
Please write me, Marie@marie.coach. Visit my website or come and be a part of People Leader Accelerator.
I like that. Smooth.
Marie, thank you again from both Jess and I, as well as from all of our listeners. The reason that we do this is to help other HR leaders accelerate their career. And boy, you've had an amazing ride. Thank you for sharing big slices of it with us. And we'll look forward to having you back if you're willing to do it again. I'm sure we saved some spicy stuff for the next few times.
Oh, yeah. Lots of spice. Chili pepper. The zesty life. Come on, we can do it.